online. First, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the WAF Climate and Energy Practice for hosting us here today. My name is James Snyder. I'm the Vice President of the Science, Knowledge, and Innovation team at WF Canada, based out of Toronto, Canada, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. Thank you for joining us for today's panel on Indigenous-led nature-based climate solutions. The connection between climate change and biodiversity loss is clear. We collectively increasingly recognize the solutions that we take to mitigate climate change through reducing GHG emissions can also be the actions that directly benefit the recovery of biodiversity and vice versa. Over the last year, including in Canada at COP15 for the new Global Biodiversity Framework, we have seen growing ambition and a clear path forward to ensure a deep connection between our actions on climate and on biodiversity. To do so in a fair and equitable way, we also have to recognize that a rights-based approach is crucial to meet these ambitious goals and targets. The recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights and responsibilities are foundational in the actions that we take. And in part, supporting Indigenous-led conservation actions, those that support Indigenous peoples' priorities, culture, and knowledge systems is a cornerstone of what effective nature-based climate solutions ought to be. Today, we'll be learning about Indigenous-led nature-based climate solutions, projects underway in Canada, and how those efforts can support climate change mitigation, resilience, recovery, and protection of biodiversity, and to deliver livelihoods and well-being for local communities. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. To my right, we're joined by Stephen Ita, Managing Director of Canada and Nature for Justice. A member of the Lutselk'e Dene First Nation, Stephen Ita was raised by his grandparents on the land along the east arm of Great Slave Lake. He was elected to the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly in 1999 and elected chief of the Lutselk'e Dene First Nation in 2008. Stephen served as the nation's lead negotiator in the creation of the Thaidane Indigenous Protected Area, one of the largest protected areas in North America. He was also a core member of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, contributing the historic report, We Rise Together, about achieving Canada's conservation goals through the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas in the spirit and practice of reconciliation. Stephen has provided invaluable counsel to Indigenous nations working to establish Indigenous and protected and conserved areas, or IPCAs, and has advocated for the federal recognition of IPCAs and Indigenous guardians, and has championed Indigenous-led conservation in international arenas. Thank you for joining us today, Stephen. Great to have you here. Joining us, actually from outside Kamloops, BC, we have Angela Kane. Angela Kane is CEO of the Sepwemikula Restoration and Stewardship Society. Ms. Kane has spent the last 20 years working with First Nations communities to help them transition from band to corporate frameworks for business development within their communities. In 2016, Ms. Kane accepted the position of Band Lands and Natural Resource Manager for the High Bar First Nation. After the devastating 2017 Elephant Hill wildfire, which swept through the central area of the Sepwemikula, 8 nations whose traditional territories were affected came together with the Flynn Road Regional Districts of 100 Mile, Kamloops, and BC wildfires. Ms. Kane represented the High Bar First Nation at the Elephant Hill Wildfire Collaboration Table. And during the collaboration with the other 7 First Nation communities and the province, she realized she had a strong passion for the stewardship of the land and wished to help and support the Elephant Hill wildfire recovery full-time. Through this commitment, she accepted the position as CEO of the Sepwemikula Restoration and Stewardship Society. She continues collaborating and advocating for the rehabilitation and restoration of First Nations traditional territory in partnership with SRSS's communities and the Elephant Hill Wildfire Joint Leadership Council. And finally, to my right, Elizabeth Hendricks, Vice President of the Restoration and Regeneration Team at WF Canada. Elizabeth leads the Restoration and Regeneration Team in achieving WF Canada's national restoration goal of 1 million hectares restored by 2030. By ensuring the right partnership, finance, and policy is in place, she aims to leverage restoration practice in Canada to address the biodiversity and climate crises. Elizabeth has considerable experience working internationally and nationally on environmental policy and led the release of the first national assessment of the health and stressors to Canada's fresh water. Elizabeth holds a BA in International Development from Dalhousie University and an MA from the University of Waterloo. Thank you for joining us, Liz, Stephen, and Angie online. Great to have everyone here today. So first, starting with Stephen, I'd like to ask our panelists to share some initial remarks and to introduce us to the work that they have underway.
Thank you, James. Thank you for the invite to participate in this panel and this important discussions around the role of nature in our collective fight against climate change. My name is Stephen Ita. I come from the Northwest Territories. Canada is uniquely positioned globally in our collective fight against climate change. Canada is one of the few places on Earth that has huge landmass, second largest landmass in the world, with intact ecosystems that's providing nature services that's benefiting the global community. And Canada is committed to protecting 30%, like many other countries, but our 30% represents over 1 million square kilometers. That 1 million square kilometers is going to be very important to give us a chance as human societies to address climate change through technology that doesn't exist today. The net and net zero is nature. And we are not investing in nature as we should be today. Canada is a first world country, but it is a small populated area. We have a tax base of around 25 million people. To pay for the effective management of over 1 million square kilometers of protected and conserved areas is out of our price range. And my message today is that we need to connect the global targets of 30% to the global efforts around climate change. We need to connect the Montreal-Coumang Accord to the Paris Accord. The summer's wildfires in Canada really highlighted that for me. Normally, we see 2.6 million acres of land being burnt. This summer, we had over 18 million acres that burnt. In the Northwest Territories, 70% of the population were evacuated, including the capital city of Yellowknife. And when you evacuate a regional center like Yellowknife, it impacts other communities that are dependent on regional centers. All of a sudden, there's no food going into the communities, no milk, no formulas. So we are seeing the impacts of climate change in real time today.
Great, thank you so much for that, Stephen, and for that introduction, and look forward to furthering the conversation. With that, I'd also like to pass it over to Angie to share her initial remarks.
Morning. Thank you for having me today. It's 6:30 in the morning here, so sorry if I'm a little not up to speed. When I started working with the Elephant Hill wildfire team, it was really apparent that the collaboration and the connection between government and Indigenous communities was lacking immensely, and that we really needed to rebuild those relationships to start rebuilding and reforesting after wildfires. Because we need to reforest from an Indigenous perspective. It's for so long, the government and licensees have been utilizing our forests and putting back for economic purposes and not so much from an ecological perspective. And this is where we're finding we're losing our medicines, we're losing our plants, we're losing the opportunity to help mitigate wildfire by not planting back our deciduous species. So through the program, through the Secwepemcúlecw Restoration and Stewardship Society, we've identified that when we restore from an Indigenous perspective. So we connect with our communities and we ask them what their priority is for areas. We ask them what type of plants and medicines that need to go back. And we work with our communities to try and restore from a balanced ecological perspective. So we're putting back for economic purposes, but also for ecological. These are crucial as we move forward in restoring our forests to try and bring them back to a more natural state. Also, too, utilizing the deciduous species, it also creates a fire barrier and helps mitigate some of those fires. So with the work of our communities within the Secwepemc and collaborating with the provincial government, we have been able to restore from that perspective. We've been able to build relationships where we work hand in hand with the provincial government on our restoration efforts.
Great. Thank you so much for that initial overview, Angie, and look forward to hearing more in a moment. I'll pass it over now to Liz to share some introductory remarks.
Thank you, James. First, I would like to send the regrets of Councillor Rick Bailey of the Katzie First Nation. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to travel at this time. So WWF has been working with the Katzie First Nation since 2019 when we began supporting their work to restore parts of the Upper Pitt River after a landslide cut off access for salmon to one of their spawning beds. This work at a high level is about building back complex ecosystems. It's about water restoration, watershed restoration, salmon protection and stewardship, and building resilient ecosystems. This work began not because the Katzie wanted to fight against the industry, land use practices, or land ownership, but because they wanted to fight for their family, the salmon. I'm going to speak from my experience of engaging with another nation's vision in land use management, which is such a colonial language, but truly, this restoration work for climate resiliency is about building relationships in the world around us. So since 2019, we've collected partnerships and grown this work to engage Katzie's 10-year vision of their watershed restoration plan. We have partners from the Government of Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Ocean, the provincial government and the Indigenous Watershed Initiative, local organizations such as Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, the Pacific Salmon Foundation, all with WWF, all are working to support the Katzie's First Nation vision for their unceded territory. So what started as making an emergency intervention for salmon spawning has grown to see a vision that has countless co-benefits, from the return of salmon in Three Rivers to restoring soil health and stabilization, increasing carbon capacity in the watershed, and consideration for Indigenous protected areas, food security, and archaeological studies in the area, connecting the Katzie to their historical land use patterns. And with that, I'll pass it back.
Great, thank you, Liz. So we've already heard a couple of common themes from the introductory remarks, but first and foremost, in my mind, and Stephen, as you brought this forward, and recognizing the fire season that we saw last year in Canada was of historical significance. I think a fire event or a collective series of events that was seen around the world. And as you noted, more than 18 million units of area were burned in that, a massive area. And so responding to fire, managing fire, building resilience to fire and other disturbance, I think, is crucial in many ways for effective and durable nature-based climate solutions. And so, Angie, I'll start with you. You began to introduce the concept of building resilience through the actions that you take in terms of restoration, using deciduous species and beyond. Can you tell us a little bit more about the activities that you've had underway the last few years? I know that in this last year alone that you were able to plant more than 450,000 trees on Secwepemc territory. Can you speak a little bit more in terms of the role of that land management and the vision to build a resilient future on Secwepemc territories?
Yeah, I sure can. And so our restoration started with a BC Salmon Innovation and Restoration Fund, and you'll see behind me in the picture, this was one of our beginning of our projects where during the 2017, we lost 200,000 hectares, which is really, at that time, we thought it was a large fire, but every year it keeps growing and growing. And to hear again this year, a total of 18 million across Canada, we are not seeing an end to it. And so that's why the work that we do is so important. But this project started us off with restoring salmon habitat, because a lot of the areas that we saw burnt in there were right down to the rivers. And so this was a part of that project that started it off. And then in 2019, we started collaborating with the World Wildlife Foundation on a carbon monitoring project to start looking at the burnt soils and determining what carbon was left and what type of nutrients would be able to, or that are in the soil to start regen. And from there, we've partnered further with tree restoration. And our first project saw us at 450,000 trees. This next year, we'll be planting 500,000 trees. And in 2025, we're looking at planting 750,000 trees, which are already being sown as we speak. And in 2026, our goal is for 1 million trees to be replanted within the Secwepemc area. We know that this is a lofty goal for us as we're just a small little society, and we're utilizing our local communities to help with this replanting piece. We also look at building capacity within our communities, so always offering opportunities for sharing knowledge and education on our restoration. We're looking at creating a seed collection program, which will be starting next year. And also now with the provincial government announcing that the seed banks that we have are becoming increasingly low because of the wildfires. We're just not able to access the seeds. So we're looking to create an ongoing seed collection program to help build our restoration efforts.
Thank you for that, Angie. And what ambitious goals that you have in terms of the restoration efforts that are both underway and into the future. The magnitude of your work and the nuance also in terms of building resilience in terms of the species that you plant and delivering restoration activities that deliver benefits for the local community and more broadly resilience, and not just putting trees in the ground, is really a crucial point, and one that I think has tremendous opportunity internationally in terms of a learning point of how we can do much more with broad-scale reforestation efforts. With Stephen, you individually have seen the effects of fire. This past year alone, you had to evacuate from your home in Yellowknife. So much of your work has been focused on Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs. Can you speak a little bit about the role of IPCAs as a means to build broader resilience on the landscape, including from fire?
Canada's commitment to protecting 17% under the Aichi Accord kicked off what Canada called Target 1 process. As part of that process, they've created some committees to look at how Indigenous nations can work with Canada to achieve the 17%, now the 30%. I was part of a working committee that engaged with Indigenous nations from coast to coast to coast. Asked a simple question: what kind of relationship would you like to have with the Canadian governments for the Canadian governments to account your protected areas towards their international commitment? Canada's in a unique place right now. Over the last decade or two, there's been a lot of work being done on the issue of Indigenous peoples and Canadian society relationships between Indigenous governments and Crown governments. Through the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to actions, the 98 recommendations, all culminating to today where we're looking at nature as one-third solution to our collective battle against climate change. Within that process holds a promise of reconciliation. My nation, for an example, negotiating relationship agreements with federal Crown governments through the National Parks Agency and the government of Northwest Territories is a relationship agreement that describes how we're going to work together. We understand each other's responsibilities, commitments, and we do have some resources available to us to do so through a trust fund. I sit on the management board of the Thaidjanannyena now. Thaidjanannyena means land of our ancestors. It's 26,380 square kilometers. It's an Indigenous protected and conserved areas. 14,000 is in relationship with the Government of Canada through its National Parks Agency. 8,000 is with under the Territorial Protected Area, and the remaining is a wildlife conservation using the Wildlife Act where the caribou will tell us if that conservation is needed into the future. It's an equal partnership between Indigenous and public governments. As a member of the board, the name of the board is Thaitininene Hatayati, those that speak for Thaitininene. And as the board, we ask the parties, the Indigenous government, the territorial government, and the Canadian government to fight all wildfires that threaten Thaitininene. They said we can't afford it. We have a let it burn policy. So, if 30% of nature globally is the 1/3 solution to our collective fight against climate change, and if the governments of the countries that are protecting that 30% can't afford to manage that 30% in the face of climate change and the impacts of climate change, then 30% by 2030 is not good enough anymore. If the tax bases of a country cannot afford to manage that 30%, to give that 30% of nature an opportunity to do its 1/3 solution job, then we're not doing a service to the nature. Nature needs our help today. As I said, there is no net zero without nature. And globally, Indigenous people make up 5% of the world's population, but hold 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, 80% of the world's nature. So there is no nature without Indigenous peoples. So what we need is for the global marketplace to invest in that 30% and revisit the issues of additionality, the issues of jurisdiction, which is a big issue for Indigenous peoples, especially those in the colonized world, like Canada, where Canada, as a colonial government, has effectively, through legislation, appropriated Indigenous peoples' lands, and we can't even qualify to put our lands in the marketplace because the marketplace is afraid that our commitments to long-term conservation would not be respected by the host provincial or federal governments. So the issue of jurisdiction has to be addressed. And the issue of additionality, where nature is not threatened by man and it doesn't qualify for the carbon markets, for an example, is a folly. Climate change is man-made, and climate change is attacking nature today. Yet nature is not qualified, or the climate change is not qualified as a threat to nature. So we need to connect the 30% that's a global target of protecting nature with global marketplaces, because nature is what's given us a chance to develop the technology, which is the two-thirds solutions that doesn't exist today. But 98% of investment is going towards that technology. And it's going up in smoke. Nature is going up in smoke, and we don't have the money to manage nature in the face of climate change.
Thank you, Stephen. And you raised such a crucial point in terms of the need not only for investment in the establishment of new Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and we've seen certainly a number of important commitments from the Government of Canada and beyond the last few years to advance IPCAs, the long-term investment to allow for the maintenance and stewardship of those important areas such that they are durable solutions both for biodiversity and for climate change mitigation is crucial, and I think that's a big conversation we'll come back to in a minute. But before doing so, I want to bring Liz into the conversation. Liz, I know that building resilience is also a big part of the efforts that you have underway alongside and led by the Katzie First Nation. How does like a resilience worldview fit into watershed restoration?
Yeah, it wasn't lost on us. Well, fires raged across Canada this past summer, and specifically in the province of British Columbia, but not in and around where we were working in the Upper Pitt River watershed. And as these fires rage, we really, thought about the importance of building back the complexity into ecosystems. You can't do just riparian restoration. You can't just plant trees. You have to do that complexity to help support and build that resiliency back into the watershed. So, I really value that the Cates's vision is a top-down approach and it is a watershed approach. And they're looking at the area holistically so that they're not just doing one or the other. It's supporting that watershed in complex ways and species in a variety of ways. So we're tree planting, we're doing riparian restoration, we're monitoring as we go as well to be able to respond and adapt to a changing system. But I think, in a bit following up to some of the comments you made, Stephen, was how nature-based solutions work. We know that, rich ecosystems will support impacts to climate change or will absorb impacts to climate change. But, this is a 10-year project. Can we build back fast enough? Can we build that resilience back into nature fast enough? Or, to support human communities as well as nature's communities.
Great. Thank you for that, Liz. Essential to what we've heard and really from the onset in terms of recognizing the role of Indigenous-led conservation as part of durable nature-based climate solutions is recognizing that a rights-based approach is necessary. That to be fair and just nature-based solutions in Canada and abroad need to be rights-based. But Stephen, in your role on the WF Canada's IPCA Support Fund Advisory Committee, you've recognized that it's not just a rights-based approach, it's also its responsibilities as a cornerstone in terms of what guides your effort. Can you introduce that idea a little bit further?
Well, Canada is a colonial country. Colonialism bred the assimilation policy. That policy created the Indian Act. The Indian Act focused on Indigenous peoples and really focused on taking away Indigenous people's responsibility. There's Indian agents that went into people's homes to take out their honey bucket. That's the level of intrusion that they practice. So for Indigenous peoples to fully exercise their rights, they have to have the responsibility and the jurisdiction to be able to apply their value systems, knowledge systems, and their sciences in their relationship with nature. Redefining what it means to have a relationship. In Thaidjan for example, we're working on Thaidjan relationship plan. Normally, it's called a management plan or land use plan. Language is important. And how we describe things has a trickle-down impact. So relationship plan speaks about a relationship. A land use plan speaks about a use. And when you're using something, you normally abuse it. And in relationship, you tend to respect a healthy relationship. And you can only have a healthy relationship if you have the capacity to exercise responsibility. And it's about reconciliation through reassuming responsibility. And in Canada, there's over 500 Indigenous protected and conserved declared from coast to coast to coast, representing over 500,000 square kilometers of land. So through Indigenous protected and conserved areas, Canada will achieve its 30%. But it means they have to give up jurisdiction and they have to recognize the constitutional rights of Indigenous peoples and provide the resources or provide the policies where resources can be drawn down from global marketplaces so that Indigenous people can exercise their responsibility to their Indigenous protected and conserved areas to help the global community through nature.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think you've introduced the concept of conservation as an act of reconciliation, also recognizing the colonial past of many conservation actions in Canada, and how moving forward that ultimately it is a rights-based approach and an approach that goes beyond rights, but also appreciation of responsibilities to the land, and what that means in terms of self-determination and governance systems ultimately to achieve effective IPCAs, not only to meet our international commitments, but also in terms of our own commitments to reconciliation. Liz, sorry, so I think I surprised you there. Can you speak about how a rights-based approach is part of the work that's underway right now with KC First Nation?
First, thank you, Stephen. I really like your connection of relationship and responsibility. I think that's a really important connection that we often overlook. So, supporting rights-based work is now a critical approach to conservation, and it's how conservation organizations should have worked in the past and now must work. We know better now, and we have to act accordingly. I think if we can't genuinely be in service of the nations we are purportedly working with, we need to question our own motivations and intentions. And to Stephen's point about responsibility and relationship, then that takes a lot of work from our end. The Katzie Nation are working on their unceded territory with their vision and direction, and being invited into this work and onto that land is a gift that we should never take for granted, and I know I don't. It is such an honor to be working in this way. Rights-based approach also means it's a humbling experience. It's relearning how to approach conservation work. It's a different approach to working with the land. It's about responsibility, it's about respect, and it's listening and responding and not reacting. And I think, yeah, it's an honor that we get to practice that and support nations who are really working in this new way.
Thank you so much for that, Liz. I want to bring Angie back into the conversation here. Angie, one of the elements that I think you spoke to in part in terms of the work that you have underway relates to delivering benefits both in terms of food security and access to traditional medicines. Can you speak to how that really guides your work at SRSS and the vision that you have in terms of the broad-scale restoration efforts that you have underway?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that was really brought forward, I mean, part of the Elephant Hill Working Group was bringing communities together, technicians, and talking about things that we lost in the fire. And it sparked us to create a natural capital evaluation, one of the first of its kind from an Indigenous perspective. We took the Elephant Hill area, excuse me, and we looked at what did we actually lose during the fire. And it was a very comprehensive 2-year, actually 2.5-year project, where compiling information right down to huckleberries and salmon, and because these are all things that were lost due to the fires. And with this comprehensive evaluation, like we identified, for example, aspirin. So from an Indigenous perspective, the person would go out and collect a specific plant or species to utilize as aspirin from their traditional way. When that fire goes through, that's all gone. I mean, it's a whole way of life lost. It's that you're taking away centuries, thousands of years of traditional knowledge. You're taking away traditional ways of thinking and knowing. It's all gone. And so by utilizing this natural capital valuation process, we identified the food sources and the plants and medicines that were lost, and realized that we needed to start finding ways to put that back into our restoration piece. And so connecting with communities to identify which is important to them at this particular time, because we're not seeing some of these species coming back. And they're, oh, sorry, lost my train of thought. It's crucial to these communities to have these species. And so that's why we've incorporated it back into our restoration piece and working with our communities to identify these areas. Unfortunately and sadly, some of the species are not coming back in these areas, but they're coming back in other areas. And so what that means is the community members have to travel farther and farther to access their food and their plants and medicines. And so, like, just to give you an example, when we completed that natural capital evaluation piece, so what was lost in that 200,000 hectares was 1.6 billion worth of economic and ecological services to First Nations communities per year. So when we look at it from that perspective, how much communities are losing when these wildfires go through, and actually how much of the land is getting utilized by these communities.
Angie, that number that you shared in terms of the natural capital assets that were lost during the Elephant Hill fire really is staggering. I mean, it's what a massive amount, and that's as an annualized number. And recognizing that the impacts of the fire on culture, on a broad suite of values is so clear. And I do want to speak about recognizing how the work that you have underway delivers a broad suite of benefits, including and the need of long-term investment in that to sort of bring back that those lost assets. But before I do, I quickly wanted to ask you one more question. I know that in response to at least the Elephant Hill fire, I know there's been subsequent fires, that there has also been a program that you've developed related to morel mushrooms that come after the fire. Do you want to speak for a moment in terms of like what that morel mushroom patrol program is and why that's so important for the work that you do?
Absolutely. So in 2017, when our communities came together, it was brought to our table that the concern of morel mushrooms were going to be coming through, and thus further impact was going to happen on the land, because we'd be seeing like hundreds and thousands possibly of mushroom pickers coming. Morel mushroom is a very sought after mushroom, and anytime there's a wildfire, you'll see these people on the land. In earlier fire areas within the Caribou, we've seen those impacts where they come onto the land and there's garbage left. There's like we've seen campers and trailers and tents, and it's just, and that's something that we really did not want to see further impact our lands. And so we created a Guardian program where we implemented garbage removal, as well as porta potties. We also had our territorial patrol out, making sure that people were safe on the land, also to sharing Indigenous knowledge of the land, and sharing with the people that, you know, whose land that they were on, and historical information, as well as just getting to know. And we found that it was a really unique situation, a real connection between settlers and Indigenous communities, and being out there on the land together and learning from each other. It was a really great knowledge sharing. But through that project, you know, what we really saw was that we removed over 24,000 tons of garbage and over 15,000 tons of human waste, just in a 1.5 month span. So the importance of having guardians out on the land is to help protect and negate the further impact that these morel mushroom projects or morel mushroom pickers come. And so we also identified a need to get our communities back out onto the land. We found one of the our members were talking about how good it felt to get out and actually start doing some good and being back on the land, and how it made them feel, and that they've been looking for something like this for a long time. So from that, a few of our communities have built out their guardianship programs to include the monitoring that takes place out on the land, to watch for wildlife, what's coming back, what's not coming back, to looking at, we've done compliance and enforcement programs with our justice system here in BC, and it provided tools to our guardians to be able to identify poachers or things that are going on the land that shouldn't be, and being able to record the information properly, so that should it go to court, that the information that they're collecting is admissible there. So the morel mushroom program actually really created our Guardian, really pushed that forward, and the need to make sure that we have people back out on the land monitoring and creating that and identifying areas that need to be protected and conserved. So it was just a really great segue into our Guardian program.
Thank you for that, Angie, and for making those connections between the restoration work and broader guardianship. Really important insights there in terms of what that means, and coming back to the rights and responsibilities piece as well. One of the underlying themes that's, I think, very clear, and Stephen, you've introduced this, is the role of long-term investment, right? If nature-based climate solutions, and I think there are great examples of effective nature-based climate solutions in Canada, whether they are to be durable over long periods of time, requires significant investment to allow for stewardship activities, that maintenance, being out on the land as through Guardians programs and beyond, as Angie just described. And so, Stephen, I want to come back to you first in terms of your vision, and you've spoken about the role of getting to 30 by 30 and moving beyond that. But how does investment in IPCAs moving towards 30 by 30, how does that also support Indigenous communities and Indigenous livelihoods from a well-being and economic perspective?
Well, based on my experience and work and research, we know that creating Indigenous protected and conserved areas can create economies of scale, especially in remote and isolated places like northern parts of the provinces and the territories, where it's very, very difficult to create any type of sustained economy. And Indigenous protected and conserved areas can support local communities, support guardians, support businesses through tourism and other economic development. Angie's project is one example of what could be many, many examples across Canada. I'd like to really emphasize that when a country the size of Canada is making their 30% commitment, it is a huge, huge commitment. We're talking over 1 million square kilometers. And our 30% is going to cover several countries that are making the same 30% commitments. So it's very important to recognize that countries like Canada, that has a small tax base, needs access to global marketplaces so that money and resources can go to the local communities so they could do work like Angie's describing. So you could create Guardians programs. So you could use traditional fires as medicines to reduce the fuel load and provide the fire that the boreal forest requires for its ecosystems. Today, with fire control and Indigenous fire management was outlawed as part of the colonial policies of Canada and the United States, Australia, colonial world. If you look at colonization, you could connect colonizations to the climate change impacts, to industrial development, how Indigenous people were treated, their lands were treated worse. And as a result, we see where we're at. We're facing down horrendous future. And as Albert Marshall says, the primary responsibility we have as human beings is to ensure that the next generation has the same healthy ecosystems that we have today. Well, we can't guarantee that now because of the impacts of the population of the world. And my people call Earth an island. We call our creator Nu Tsine. Nu is an island, Tsine is the creator of the island. Just like any other island in the world, whether it's in the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, or any lake, it's a finite resources. And we've got to be able to understand how to live in balance and reciprocity with that island. We got 8 billion plus people now. It's not about just protecting 30%. It's about relearning our value system as human species across the world. And I think Indigenous people have always held tightly to their understanding that what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. And that's the reason why 5% of the world's population has 80% of the remaining biodiversity, the remaining nature. Think about that stat. 5% of the world's population holding the 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And if you follow the news, they're doing it with their lives. They're doing it by getting thrown in jail, by getting in front of bulldozers, by getting killed by developers. There's a cost, a high cost Indigenous people have paid. And today, without that cost, without the 80%, we would be in a worse place now. That 80% remaining biodiversity on Earth is giving us a chance. Let's invest in nature. Let's invest in Indigenous people is my message. Because without that 80%, and without the 5% fighting for that 80%, we don't have a chance to develop the technology required for the 2/3 solutions. And in Canada, the raw materials that's going to go towards the technology for the 2/3 solutions is on Indigenous people's territories. So, you know, Indigenous people play an oversized responsibility when it comes to addressing climate change.
Thank you, Stephen. Wow, I mean, what amazing insight there, and what a compelling case in terms of really needing to bring forward broad-scale investment in Indigenous-led nature-based climate solutions. And I think the opportunity that Canada has on a global stage to be showing leadership in terms of how to do this in the right way, to deliver that broad suite of benefits, and to do it in a just and right way. So thank you.
But it's important, James, that the global community helps support what Canada is trying to achieve. Canada is today is an extractive, exporting nation. When you're asking the Canadian public and the Canadian taxpayers, okay, we want you to protect and not develop 30% of your country's resources, and then you ask them to pay for it with their limited tax base, there's not going to be a high degree of interest by the tax base of Canada to do that. That's why it's important that we open up the global marketplace to support places like Canada that has an outsized responsibility in our collective fight against climate change. We have the nature, and we have the raw materials in our lands to address the 2/3 solutions. And we need global investment for that. And we could do it in a way where Indigenous people's rights and responsibilities are centered.
Well, thank you. I mean, what a convincing case. I want to bring Angie back into the conversation, and through the lens of the conservation economy more broadly in Indigenous economies, Angie, and I know that much of what you do is through the lens of Indigenous-owned and operated business. Can you also speak about the role of supporting nursery capacity? Like, you have very big goals in the years ahead. I think you mentioned 1 million trees a year, and I imagine that nursery capacity is a major hurdle for you. Can you speak to your plans in terms of what that looks like in terms of delivering benefit to the local community from a conservation economy perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we identified early on was the access to seed supply as well as nursery space. A lot of our nurseries here in BC are owned, or actually we're getting to a point where they're starting to be monopolized by one large company that only grows for economic. So for pine, anything that can be harvested at a very quick rate. So for us to access the growing space we were always competing, or we didn't know if we'd be able to get that space. And so we've been able to connect with a local nursery up in the Caribou area that started growing some of our seedlings for us, and had a conversation around expansion. And so currently we're just looking at expanding, it's actually doubling their capacity because they're at 1.2 million. And the one beautiful thing that I love about this nursery is she loves to support smaller businesses like local woodlots that are replanting for their areas as well as other. And so we're talking 50, 60,000 seedlings. So, and she also plants for the provincial government. So we needed an area to cover our 1 million trees, or our goal. And so, like I said, we're in the process of doubling that capacity. And we're also looking at creating a research greenhouse that looks at growing or germinating and growing our food species as well as our medicines, the shrubs and trees that need to go back out onto the land. Because it's not always that easy. I mean, you can find the seed, but to get them to germinate, it takes, Mother Nature is the best at growing. And when you start adding the human part into that, it's not always successful. So it's looking at trying to find that fine balance. We're also looking at trying to incorporate different mediums like biochar into the seedling growth, as peat moss is now going to be something that is not going to be accessible. So that is also going to be a challenge. What type of medium is going to work and give the higher success rate for growing these seedlings? So we're expanding on nursery space, but we're also doing research pieces on mediums as well as food sources and medicines to put back onto the land. Yeah, it's a really exciting opportunity for us. And right now there's only really one other nursery that's being utilized, but they're at their capacity, and they're also looking to double, because moving forward with the new landscape level plans for forestry, they're now looking at incorporating more and more of these natural species into replanting. So our goal, or our hope, is that the provincial government will start forcing or legislating licensees to start implementing these stocking standards into their reforestation. So it's not just for economic purposes, but also planting back for ecological.
Thank you for sharing that detail and understanding the role and opportunity of nursery expansion, Angie, and what a tremendous and exciting opportunity that you have in front of you in terms of the work that you have underway and the broad suite of benefits that your work can deliver. So Liz, coming back to you here in the room, certainly your role as VP of Restoration and Regeneration, and we've been talking a lot in Canada about restoration over the last year, in part with the big commitments made in Montreal through the Global Biodiversity Framework, and what that means in terms of a new protected areas goal, 30 by 30, that we've spoken about today, but also in terms of restoration. And maybe you could speak a little bit about why, like, the investment in restoration at scale over long periods of time is crucial to meet those goals.
Well, I also want to say what Angie and Steve said, but I will add to their points around investment is, of course, nature needs investment for durability. It's like we invest in factories to have technological improvements to last decades long. And so this idea that nature-based solutions or our ecosystems would work for us, our fishing industries, our extractive resources would work for us, and we wouldn't invest, is just, what is it? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, right? We just have to change the way we think of investments, and investing in nature and investing in, as Angie said, Mother Nature for that reproduction of those tree species is critical. It is that path forward. And that is changing how, whether you want to call it full cost accounting or subsidies, that's for the economists to figure out, but it is, shifting investment and wealth from how we think of the services that nature provides us. And I would add also, bringing it back to this idea of relationships in restoration, and it is reconciliation, Steve, and I agree with you, is investment is part of building back that relationship. It is one part of having and creating a relationship that allows people on the land. And it's exciting. You know, the Katzie have brought investment to their land. They are also now hiring, they recently hired their first guardian to also work on the land. They do have a team of folk. And they are building up the capacity within the community. And so you can see it beginning to perpetuate within just that one nation and, well, and other nations as we're listening tonight. And so it's happening, and we just have to make it a bigger investment and keep going.
Thank you for that. So we're quickly coming to the close of our time here. With a couple of minutes remaining, I just want to see if there's an opportunity for questions in the room or online. Okay. One question in the room? Okay, great. Would you like the microphone? Yeah, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks so much for the great event, great panel, super interesting, and great to hear about the fantastic projects happening on the ground. So my question is how can we prevent, so it seems like you're calling for kind of global finance, particularly, you know, in terms in the form of perhaps carbon markets, it seemed. And so how can we prevent these carbon markets from becoming another neo-colonial tool and having these kind of perverse effects that some communities, indigenous communities, particularly in the global south, have experienced? So how can some, you know, see carbon credits as potentially opening the door for land grabs? I haven't seen that so much in Canada necessarily. I'm curious, have you, and how are these risks being mitigated, and how can this be prevented?
Stephen, I think that's a question for you.
Well, I think colonial history is repeating itself when it comes to carbon markets already. The marketplace is focused on carbon and carbon only. It's forgetting about the biodiversity. It's forgetting about building back better human rights. I made the connection that 5% of the world's population is indigenous, and they have 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. It would make sense from a capitalistic perspective to invest in what's proven to work. And what's proven to work is indigenous people's worldviews, value systems, knowledge, and science in maintaining a reciprocal relationship with their nature, which is the healthiest in the world. So instead of doubling down on colonial practices, let's really bring forward the capitalist system that proves that if you invest in what's proven to work, then that should be what's happening, but it's not. It's going after the quick buck and just focusing on carbon and trampling people's rights, people's responsibilities, and people's human relationship with their nature. That's not going to help with our collective fight against climate change. So what I'm saying is, let's invest in indigenous people so that they can use the resources to continue their healthy relationship with their nature, so that can give us a fighting chance to bring technology up to speed. It's not happening now. Technology is not there. The only thing that's proven to work to extract carbon from the atmosphere is nature. And the best people to care for nature is indigenous peoples. So let's uncondition ourselves as human society. In Canada, colonialism and the assimilation policy was targeted at indigenous people, but all Canadians were conditioned by that policy. They were conditioned to be indifferent to what their government was doing to indigenous peoples. In Canada and around the world, that's the case. So as human societies, we need to uncondition ourselves to what's brought us to this point of self-destructive behaviors and practices. Even the Bible says you could bend nature to your will. So there's been a lot of conditioning happening globally that we need to uncondition from. And let's start with unconditioning ourselves to how we perceive indigenous peoples to be. based on what you've been taught. Recognize the science. They have the healthiest land in the world. Let's invest in them.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, and thank you for that response, Stephen. And unfortunately, while I think we can keep this conversation going for sure, we've come to the time for our allotted time for the day. I want to thank you all in the room here today and those of you online for joining us for the event today. And I want to thank the panel here, Stephen, Angie, joining us bright and early from Kamloops, BC. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you all online and in the room. Have a great day, everyone. Okay.